She had no intention of killing a mob boss. But as the teacup trembled in her hand, as the gun was pointed at her chest, as the man who had kissed her this morning stepped back with tears, and the gun, Selene Carter understood one thing. She had never been Julian Choi's lover. She was a pawn, and the only person in the room who wasn't surprised was his brother. This is the story of a woman who walked into the most beautiful trap New York ever set, and walked out with her head held high. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't turn off the video, because the ending will leave you breathless. The morning Selene Carter walked into the wrong man's orbit, she was running 11 minutes late and her left heel was cracked. Not broken, cracked. The kind of damage you could hide if you kept moving and didn't put too much weight on any one thing. She'd learned that trick young. Growing up in Morrisania, you learned early what you could carry and what would eventually split you open. So she walked fast down the wet sidewalk outside her studio on Morris Avenue, umbrella tucked under one arm, leather portfolio under the other, coffee going cold in her hand, and she told herself the heel would hold until Thursday when she got paid. It held. That was the last thing that went right for a very long time. Her studio occupied the second floor above a Haitian restaurant that filled the stairwell with the smell of rice and Scotch bonnet peppers every afternoon. The sign on the frosted glass door read, Carter Presents Consulting in clean black lettering she'd stenciled herself 3 years ago when she'd used the last of her savings to sign a lease on a space that smelled like mold and old ambition. She'd scraped the mold off the walls with bleach and her own hands. The ambition she'd brought herself. She taught posture. She taught eye contact, vocal cadence, the specific geography of a handshake that made powerful people take you seriously. She taught the children of wealthy families how to sit at tables they hadn't earned yet. She taught executives from outer boroughs how to walk into rooms built for men who looked nothing like them. She was exceptionally good at it. She was also perpetually underpaid and 3 months behind on her equipment lease. She had 11 clients that Tuesday. None of them were Julian Choi. He arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon without an appointment, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than her monthly rent and carrying himself with the particular brand of ease that belongs only to men who have never once waited for anything. He was not loud about it. That was the first thing she noticed. The dangerous ones were never loud. They moved quietly through rooms like water finding the path of least resistance, and by the time you understood what was happening, the floor was already wet. He knocked on the open door frame even though the door was open. That was calculated. She knew it was calculated even then. She just didn't know yet what he was calculating. Ms. Carter? She was reviewing session notes at her desk, reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She looked up without rushing. She'd learned not to rush when men she didn't recognize appeared in her doorway. It gave them too much, too fast. That depends on who's asking. He smiled. It was a good smile. Not the blinding kind that made you distrust it immediately, but the quiet kind. The kind that arrived slowly, like he was deciding whether you deserved it. Later, she would understand that smile had been rehearsed across decades of manipulation until it felt as natural as breathing. My name is Julian Choi. I was referred by Margaret Huang. She said you helped her son before his Oxford interview. I remember Margaret. Selene removed her glasses entirely and set them on the desk. She didn't mention she was sending anyone. It was a last-minute decision. He stayed in the doorway, not pushing, not retreating. I have a nephew, 8 years old. He's going through a difficult time, and I thought structured guidance, someone patient, might help him more than another therapist. She studied him the way she studied all clients, not their clothes or their face, but the space between their words, the pauses, the breath control. Julian Choi breathed like a man who had rehearsed this conversation. I don't work with children as a standard practice, she said. I know. Margaret told me that too. He finally stepped through the door, just barely, just enough to close the distance without crowding it. I'm prepared to compensate you well above your standard rate. Mr. Choi. She kept her voice flat. I charge what I charge because it reflects the value of the work. If you're here to negotiate my rates upward before we've even discussed the scope, I'm going to wonder what else you're planning to negotiate. Something crossed his face then. Not irritation. Something closer to genuine surprise. The look of a man who hadn't expected pushback from this particular source. It vanished quickly, replaced by that slow smile again. "Fair," he said. "You're right. I apologize. Can I sit down?" She gestured to the client chair across from her desk. That was the second thing that went wrong. His nephew's name was Eli, and he was, as Julian described, going through a difficult time. He ate almost nothing. He didn't speak to adults he didn't trust, which was most adults. He had been pulled from 2 private schools in 8 months for what Julian called behavioral incidents, and what Selene, after their 3rd session together, recognized as a child performing catastrophic internal distress through the only vocabulary an 8-year-old boy possessed. She'd seen it before, not in private schools, but in the Bronx, in boys whose home environments were too loud and too unpredictable for their nervous systems to process safely. The behaviors looked different depending on the zip code. The Morrisania version threw chairs, the Upper East Side version went silent and stopped eating. But the root was identical. Something in this child's home was wrong. She didn't say that to Julian. Not yet. She filed it and kept working because Eli was worth working for. He was a quiet boy with dark, serious eyes and the habit of tucking his hands under his thighs when something frightened him, as if he could physically contain his own reaction. He was also startlingly intelligent in the way that very lonely children often were, having spent too much time inside their own heads, and not enough time running around outside, being stupid the way children were supposed to be. By the end of the 2nd session, he had started talking to her. Not about anything significant, about a documentary he'd watched on deep-sea fish, about a book he'd read twice because the ending confused him. But he looked at her when he spoke, and that, for Eli Choi at that stage, was significant. Julian was always early to pick him up. That was where the other thing began. The thing Selene hadn't planned for. Julian would arrive 20 minutes before the session ended and wait in the hallway, and she would find him there when she walked Eli out, and they would exchange a few words, and those few words slowly, across 6 weeks, became longer conversations. And those conversations eventually moved downstairs to the Haitian restaurant where Julian ate jerk chicken with visible pleasure and asked her questions about her life that felt genuinely curious rather than politely obligatory. He wanted to know where she was from. He wanted to know how she'd built the business. He was interested in the mechanics of what she did, the psychology of presence, the way a body communicated hierarchies before a single word was spoken, in a way that felt real. She was, despite everything she knew about reading rooms and reading people, disarmed by it. She was also tired, not the surface kind of tired. The deep kind, the kind that accumulates in women who spend years being excellent in total isolation, who build everything themselves and come home to empty apartments and feel proud of that, and also quietly devastated by it in equal measure. She was 34 years old, and she had not allowed herself to want anything she hadn't earned through demonstrable effort, which meant she had denied herself a significant number of things, including the uncomplicated experience of someone choosing her. Julian Choi chose her with what felt like intention. She knew the risks. She thought she knew the risks. She did not know the risks. The dinner he took her to 6 weeks after their first conversation was in a restaurant in Tribeca, where the tables had no numbers, and the menu had no prices, and the sommelier addressed Julian by name without being told it. Selene wore a dress she'd owned for 2 years and had never had occasion to use, and she sat across from him in a room built entirely for people who had not grown up in public housing, and she did not let it touch her. She knew how to be in rooms. That was literally her job. Julian watched her navigate the space with what she later decided was calculation disguised as admiration. "You don't perform," he said, midway through the 2nd course. "Excuse me?" Most people in a room like this, new money, aspirational money, they perform. They try very hard to look like they belong. You don't do that, you just are. "I grew up poor," she said, because she had decided long ago not to be ashamed of it, and the only way not to be ashamed was to say it plainly. "I stopped trying to look like I belonged somewhere about 20 years ago. You belong wherever you put your feet." "That's exactly what I mean." He looked at her across the candlelight with something in his eyes she couldn't fully categorize. "You're the most self-possessed person I've met in a long time." She should have heard the calculation in it. She heard, instead, something that resonated. That was her real mistake. Not the trust. Trust was buildable and retractable, a managed risk. The real mistake was allowing herself to be seen, or to believe she was being seen, which in the end amounted to the same wound. By October, she was sleeping with him. By November, she had met his father. The Choi estate in Westchester sat behind iron gates and mature oaks that had been growing since before any of the current Choi family were alive. It was the kind of property that had been accumulated rather than purchased, added to across generations, shaped by money that had been moving long enough to forget where it originally came from. The house itself was enormous in the particular way of old inherited wealth. Not showy, not minimalist, but dense, layered, every room full of objects that had histories and every history slightly unspoken. Security was visible, armed, uniformed, stationed at regular intervals along the perimeter and at every interior entry point. More than was normal. More than made sense for a private residence, even in the category of private residences that had security at all. Selene noticed. She filed it. She'd been filing a lot of things. Jinsu Choi received her in a study that smelled of cedar and old paper. He was 71 years old and looked like a man who had converted his body into pure function decades ago and hadn't looked back. Nothing about him was decorative. His face was lined deeply, asymmetrically, the way faces became when they'd processed too many significant events to settle back into neutrality. He wore no watch. His hands, Selene noticed, were the hands of someone who had used them for physical work at some point in his life and never quite lost the architecture. He was also, she realized, within approximately 90 seconds of being in the same room with him, the most dangerous person she had ever met. Not because of anything he said. He was perfectly courteous. He asked about her background, her work, her family, in the measured tones of a man conducting an interview he had already decided the outcome of. The danger was subtextual, structural. It emanated from the way everyone else in the room oriented toward him without appearing to, the way space in his presence became organized around his position, the way iron filings oriented around a magnetic field. Julian sat beside her and touched her hand once, lightly, in a gesture that was for his father's consumption rather than hers. She felt that clearly. She smiled through dinner and answered every question honestly because the only tool she had in this room was the truth, and she was not giving it up. Kyle Choi did not join them for dinner. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the hallway outside the dining room. A brief exchange in Korean with one of the security staff, and then silence. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jinsu's eyes moved to the door and back without his expression changing. Nobody said anything. She met him 2 hours later, standing in the east corridor of the house where she'd gone looking for a bathroom, and had instead found a stretch of polished marble hallway lined with framed photographs she'd stopped to look at. Family photographs mostly, spanning decades. Jinsu younger, Jinsu's wife, whose name she didn't know, 2 boys growing into 2 men, the estate in various seasonal states. The images had the slightly formal quality of photographs taken in the awareness of being archival. Kyle was standing at the corridor's end, jacket off, tie loose, looking at a photograph she couldn't see from her position. He heard her before she announced herself. She saw the slight change in his posture. But he didn't turn immediately. When he did turn, she got her first real look at him. He was different from Julian in every way that wasn't immediately obvious. Same height, similar build, but where Julian's physical presence communicated welcome, open posture, ready smile, a body language engineered to reduce threat perception, Kyle Choi radiated the inverse. He was still. Not relaxed still, but controlled still. The kind of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to eliminate involuntary movement from their repertoire. His knuckles on his right hand were scarred in the patterned way that came from repeated impact, not accident. His eyes, when they found her, were dark and entirely unreadable, and they took her in with the comprehensive, categorizing speed of someone who'd spent a long time professionally assessing what situations and people could do to him. "You must be the etiquette teacher," he said. His voice was flat, not unfriendly, not friendly, simply flat, stripped of the social lubrication that most people applied without thinking. "And you must be the brother who wasn't at dinner." "I had other things." He looked back at the photograph briefly, then at her again. "How'd it go?" "Your father is an interesting man." "That's a diplomatic answer." "I'm a diplomatic person." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but a change in the quality of his stillness. "Julian tell you much about the family?" "Enough." Meaning not much. She didn't answer that, which was itself an answer. Kyle Choi studied her for another 3 seconds. She counted because she was the kind of person who counted. And then he said something that she would return to in the weeks ahead with the obsessive repetition of someone who had heard a warning and failed to understand it in time. "You're sleeping with the wrong brother." He said it quietly. No heat in it, almost conversational. Then he walked past her down the corridor without looking back, and she stood alone with the photographs and the words, and she told herself it was a power play, territorial behavior, a man asserting dominance over his brother's girlfriend through implication. She told herself that for almost 3 weeks. Then she met Michelle Park, not Michelle herself. Michelle was already gone by then, though Selene didn't know what that meant yet. She met her through Eli, which was how she met most of the real things about this family. Through the child who didn't know how to perform the family's mythology because he'd been living inside it too long to see it from the outside. It was a Thursday session. Eli had been more engaged than usual. They'd been working on what Selene framed as communication mapping, which for a practical 8-year-old meant talking about who in his life he could say different things to and why, drawing it out in colored markers on a big pad of paper. He'd been drawing the circle of people he could talk to, and it had been, quietly, devastating. It was a very small circle, Selene at its edge and almost nothing at its center. In the middle of sketching the diagram, he stopped and said, without looking up from the paper, "Julian's friend used to sit where you're sitting." Selene kept her voice even. "Oh yeah? She helped me with reading. She was nice." A pause. The marker kept moving. "She left." "When did she leave?" "A long time ago." His voice had gone carefully flat in the way children's voices went when they were repeating an answer they'd been given rather than a thing they believed. "Julian said she went to California." "Did she tell you she was going?" The marker stopped. Eli looked up at her and said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "She didn't say goodbye," and went back to the drawing, and Selene spent the remainder of that session in a state of controlled calm that cost her more effort than anything she'd done in years. That night, she sat in her apartment on the 6th floor of a building on Tremont Avenue, and she wrote down everything she knew and everything she suspected and everything that didn't add up, and the list was longer than she wanted it to be. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the metal box under her bed where she kept the documents that mattered. And she went to sleep because she had a full schedule the next morning, and panic was not a luxury she'd ever been able to afford. She called Kyle Choi the following afternoon. She had his number because Julian had given it to her weeks ago under the casual framing of family contact, emergencies only. She had filed it without comment and hadn't used it. She used it now. He picked up on the second ring. "I have questions," she said. Silence on the line. Then, "I know. About a woman named Michelle Park." Another silence, longer. She heard him breathe once. "Not on the phone. Where are you?" She told him. He told her where to meet him and when, and hung up before she could ask anything else. And she sat with her phone in her hand and felt the particular cold clarity of a person who has asked the question they cannot take back. The meeting was in a parking structure in Mott Haven, which was a neighborhood she knew, and he almost certainly chose for that reason. On her ground, not his, which either meant he was trying to make her comfortable or he was demonstrating that he knew enough about her to know her ground, and she wasn't certain which of those options was better. He was already there when she arrived, leaning against a concrete pillar on the 3rd level, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his eyes moving across all 3 visible entry and exit points in a sweep that took approximately 2 seconds and was completed before he settled his gaze on her. She walked to within 6 feet of him and stopped. "Michelle Park," she said. She worked for my father's company," Kyle said. "Legal department. She and Julian were together for about 7 months." He looked at her steadily. "She's not in California." Selene held his gaze. Her heart was doing something loud and unpleasant in her chest, but she had learned, across years of entering rooms where she was not supposed to be comfortable, to keep that entirely interior. "Where is she?" "I don't know exactly." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I know she's not alive." The concrete structure held them in gray silence. 3 floors below, traffic moved. Selene breathed twice, carefully. "And Julian? Julian is my brother." Kyle said it the way you stated a fact about weather, something true and essentially impersonal. "He is also the most dangerous person in that house, And everyone, including my father, underestimates that because he smiles better. Why are you telling me this? Because you called me. He paused. And because I've been watching what happens to women in that house for a long time, and I'm done watching. She studied him. The scarred knuckles, the stillness, the way he distributed his weight slightly forward as if perpetually prepared to move. And she tried to calculate the cost of trusting a man who was part of the machinery she was trying to understand. It was a bad calculation. All the variables were unknown. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He told her. And the offer he made was so specific, so carefully constructed, so clearly something he had thought through long before she called, that she understood two things simultaneously. First, that Kyle Choi had been waiting for exactly this conversation. And second, that whatever she had believed she was walking into over the past 3 months, whatever version of this story she had been telling herself, was not the true version. The true version was worse. She was still standing there, working through the implications when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. A text from Julian. "Dinner tonight? I have something I want to ask you." She looked at the text. She looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at the text, which she had not turned away from him, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The geometry was already clear. She was standing in a parking structure in Mott Haven, being offered a lifeline by a man who frightened her, and on her phone screen was the man who intended to use her up and discard her, and the only question remaining was what she was going to do with the next 60 seconds. Selene Carter had spent her entire life making decisions in 60 seconds that other people never had to make at all. She put the phone back in her pocket. "Tell me," she said, "exactly what you need me to do." Kyle's eyes moved over her face with that comprehensive, cataloging speed, as if he was making a final assessment of something he was about to bet everything on. "I need you to go to that dinner," he said, "and say yes to whatever he asks." She felt something cold settle into the architecture of her chest, below the sternum, the place where fear lived when it got old enough to stop moving and just reside. "And if what he asks is something I can't come back from," Kyle held her gaze. "Everything he's going to ask you," he said, "you can come back from, if you're careful." He paused. The women who didn't make it back weren't careful. He turned and walked to the stairwell, and his footsteps echoed down the concrete levels. And then he was gone, and Selene stood alone on the 3rd floor of a parking structure in the Bronx with the weight of what she now knew pressing against the inside of her ribs like something that wanted out. She stood there for a long time. Then she walked to her car, sat behind the wheel, and texted Julian back. "Yes. Where and when?" She pressed send. And the trap she had just agreed to walk back into, willingly, calculatedly, with her eyes now entirely open, closed around her like the teeth of something patient and very old. The restaurant Julian chose was in the West Village, the kind of place with no sign outside and a door that looked deliberately unremarkable, the kind of unremarkable that cost significant money to maintain. Selene arrived 4 minutes early because she always arrived 4 minutes early. It gave her time to read the room before anyone was watching her read it. She sat across from him and ate calmly and laughed at the right moments, and touched his hand twice across the table, and the entire time some interior part of her was standing slightly apart from her own body, watching herself perform, cataloging every micro-expression on his face with the systematic attention of someone who now understood what the performance was for. Julian was in a good mood. That was its own kind of information. He ordered the wine without asking her preference, which he had always done and which she had always let pass. But now she watched the gesture differently. The casual assumption of authority over small decisions, the way it was framed as attentiveness rather than control. He poured her glass first. He smiled when he did it. She smiled back. "I've been thinking," he said midway through the 2nd course, "about what the next year looks like." "For the company? For us." He set his fork down and looked at her with the full focused attention he deployed when he wanted something, when he needed the other person to feel the complete weight of his consideration. "My father's health is declining faster than the doctors initially projected. There's going to be a transition period, significant, very public." "I'm sorry about your father," she said, and she meant it in the complicated way you could mean something about a man who terrified you. "The transition will require," he paused, choosing, "a certain presentation. The board, the partners, the associated organizations. They need to see stability, continuity." His eyes stayed on hers. They need to see a man who has built something lasting. Selene held his gaze and kept her breathing even and said nothing, because she had learned in the hours since the parking structure that silence was the most valuable thing she currently possessed. "I want you beside me through this," Julian said. "Formally." "Formally," she repeated. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a ring on the table between their plates. It was extraordinary. That was the first thing. It was genuinely extraordinary. A dark cushion-cut stone surrounded by pave diamonds in a platinum setting that caught the candlelight with the specific authority of something very old and very expensive. She looked at it for 3 seconds before she looked back up at him. "Julian, I know it's fast." He wasn't asking, she noticed. He was preemptively absorbing her resistance. "I know that's what you're going to say, but I also know," the slow smile, "that you don't waste time on things that aren't real. Neither do I. This is real." She picked up the ring, turned it once in the candlelight. The stone had a darkness at its center that was almost violet, almost black, shifting as the light angle changed. It was beautiful the way certain dangerous things were beautiful, completely and without apology. "This is an extraordinary ring," she said carefully. "It belonged to a woman who no longer has use for it." He said it without a flicker. "It's been reset. It suits you." She looked at him across the table, and in that moment she understood, with the clarifying cold of someone who has just stepped off solid ground, that the woman who had owned this ring before was Michelle Park. She understood it not from evidence, but from the way he'd said, "no longer has use for it." The specific past tense, the specific absence of any emotion around it, the fact that he'd told her at all, as if he was testing something, measuring how much she heard versus how much she processed. She slid the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she said. Julian smiled. It reached his eyes. That was the most frightening thing about it. She called Kyle from the bathroom 20 minutes later, the ring cold and heavy on her hand, the ambient noise of the restaurant bleeding under the door. "He proposed," she said when Kyle picked up. A pause. "With a ring?" "Dark stone, cushion cut. He said it belonged to a woman who no longer needs it." The silence on the line this time was different from the others. Denser. She heard him exhale once through his nose. "Don't take it off," he said. "I'm not planning to. And don't react to it when you're with him. He's watching for a reaction." "I know he's watching." She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her own face. Familiar. Composed. The face she'd constructed over 34 years of needing to look like she was handling things. "Kyle?" She kept her voice very flat. "Was that ring on Michelle's hand when she disappeared?" Another pause. "Yes," he said. She breathed, in, then out. "Okay," she said, and went back to the table and sat across from Julian and let him pour her more wine, and talked about the future for another hour with Michelle Park's ring on her hand and murder sitting between them like a third guest who hadn't ordered anything. The engagement was not announced publicly, not immediately. Julian wanted to wait for the right moment, which Selene understood meant he was waiting for conditions to be correct for whatever the announcement was designed to accomplish. In the meantime, she wore the ring and appeared at 2 dinners at the estate and attended a board function at the Choi Corporation's Midtown offices, where she was introduced to 11 powerful men who looked at her the way men like that looked at women attached to men like Julian, assessing value, calibrating threat, noting that she was attractive and educated and from nowhere significant and moving on. She was invisible in exactly the way Julian needed her to be. She worked it. She was very good at being what rooms needed. Eli noticed the ring the next Thursday. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, turning his juice glass in both hands the way he did when he was processing something he hadn't yet decided to say out loud. Selene waited. She had learned to wait for Eli. "Are you going to live in the house?" he finally asked. "I don't know yet. Would that be okay with you?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything seriously, like a small person who had never had the luxury of treating questions as rhetorical. "Michelle was going to," he said. Julian asked her and she said yes, and then she went away. Selene kept her hands loose in her lap. "What do you remember about Michelle going away?" He looked at his juice glass. "There was a lot of noise," he said quietly. "Late at night. And then she wasn't there in the morning." A pause. And Julian wasn't there either. He came back the next day. Did you tell anyone? I told Kyle. He glanced up at her. Kyle said I imagined it. Do you think you imagined it? Eli Choi looked at her with his dark, serious eyes and said nothing. The answer was in the nothing. She reported this to Kyle that same afternoon, outside, in the parking lot of a grocery store in Parkchester, where she sat in her car and he sat in his, and they spoke through the cracked windows because he'd insisted on no phones for anything that mattered. Kyle listened to all of it without expression. He had the quality, she'd come to notice, of receiving bad information without visible escalation. Not because it didn't land, but because whatever process he used to absorb it was entirely internal and left nothing on the surface. She found it simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. He was there that night, Kyle said when she finished. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking through the windshield at the grocery store's brick wall. I know he was. I couldn't prove it, and Eli was 8 years old and terrified, and my father had already decided the narrative. Your father knew. My father gave the order. He said it flat. Julian carried it out. That's how it works in that family. Has worked for 40 years. He paused. I was not... The pause stretched, unaware of what my family was when I was growing up. But Michelle was different. She mattered. To you. He didn't answer that. Kyle. Selene turned in her seat to look at him directly. He kept his eyes on the wall. How long have you been building the case? 14 months. How much do you have? Enough to finish it, not enough to start it. He finally turned and looked at her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't expected to find there. The particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a weight in private for a very long time. I need access to the internal financial servers. Julian controls the server credentials since my father got sick. The access logs, the wire transfer records, the evidence that connects the criminal operations to Julian personally rather than just to the corporation. And you need me to get them. I need you to get close enough to get them. You're already close enough. He paused. You're in a position I couldn't manufacture. He trusts you. She looked at him for a moment. Does he? Something moved across Kyle's face. As much as Julian trusts anyone. That's not especially reassuring. No, he said. It's not. She drove back to the Bronx in the late afternoon, the city going gray around her, the FDR packed solid in the southbound lanes, exhaust rising in the cold air, and she sat in traffic, and she thought about what it meant to be trusted by a man who had slid a dead woman's ring onto her finger and smiled while he did it. She thought about Eli's voice saying there was a lot of noise late at night. She thought about Michelle Park, who had said yes to the same man for what she'd believed were real reasons, and who had not made it to California. She thought about her own apartment, her own studio, her own name on the frosted glass door. She thought about how many things she had built that could be unmade. The conversation with Julian that she hadn't expected came on a Sunday. He arrived at her apartment unannounced, which he had done before and which she had allowed, understanding it as a control behavior that had not yet become threatening and would eventually. She opened the door and he was standing there in civilian clothing, jeans, a dark sweater, slightly undone in the way that was also calculated, carrying coffee from a place she'd mentioned once in passing, which meant he'd remembered, or more likely, his assistant had remembered, and he was presenting it as his own attention. You look tired, he said. I'm fine. Selene. He came in, set the coffee on her counter, turned to look at her apartment with the particular comprehensive assessment he applied to all spaces, reading value, reading history. Talk to me. About what? About whatever's been in your face for the past 2 weeks. He turned back to her. The charcoal eyes were steady and calm and absolutely unreadable. You're good. You're very good. But something changed, and I want to know what. Her chest tightened once and released. She breathed. I'm processing, she said. The engagement, your father, the pace of everything. I'm not... She paused, making it look like she was searching for words rather than carefully selecting them. I'm not someone who moves through major life changes without needing time to absorb them. That's fair. He kept watching her. And I'm worried about Eli. That landed differently than she'd intended. Julian's expression shifted in a way she couldn't fully read. Something tightened in the area around his eyes, a micro-contraction too brief to categorize with certainty. Eli is fine. Julian, he's not fine. He barely eats. He doesn't sleep. He told me last week he woke up at 3 in the morning 3 times and couldn't go back to sleep. He needs more support than I can provide twice a week. I've had him evaluated by 3 therapists, and none of them have made progress with him because they're seeing him in a clinical environment where he knows he's being assessed. He talks to me because I'm not trying to diagnose him. She kept her voice even. I'm telling you as someone who cares about him that your nephew needs more stability than he currently has. Julian was silent for a moment. Then, what kind of stability? Consistency, routine, a home environment that feels safe. She looked at him steadily. What does his day-to-day look like inside the house? He has everything he needs. That's not what I asked. The room held the silence for 3 seconds. Julian looked at her, and she looked at him. And the distance between what they were each actually thinking and what was being said in that room was the width of everything. He's a Choi, Julian said finally, in a tone that was meant to close the subject. He'll learn to manage. She nodded. She let it go. She tucked it away with all the other things she was tucking away, which was beginning to feel like carrying a second skeleton inside her own body, something parallel and heavy that only she knew was there. 2 days later, Julian told her about the boardroom. It was presented as a meeting she would find interesting, a glimpse behind the operational curtain, an act of inclusion, proof that he saw her as a partner in the actual sense of the word. She understood it as something else, a test of whether she would perform correctly in front of people who mattered. The Choi Corporation's boardroom occupied the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown and had floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides that turned the city into a display, something observed rather than inhabited. 8 men were already seated when Julian brought her in, not introduced to her. She was introduced to them, presented, which was a different thing. She stood at the head of the table beside Julian and smiled and said the right things, and watched 8 powerful men calibrate their opinion of her in real time. Watched them find her acceptable in the particular way that meant they didn't see her as a variable. That was what Julian needed her to be. A fixture, part of the background. She was very good at being underestimated. Then a man named Gerard Wass, 60-something, seated second from the left, leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the kind of direct appraisal that was not quite rude and not quite anything else and said, Julian tells us you come from the Bronx. Born and raised, she said pleasantly. Interesting choice. He paused. For a man in Julian's position. Gerard. Julian's voice was light, the kind of light that had mass behind it. I only mean... Wass opened his hands in a gesture of performed openness. That image matters. In transition periods particularly. The wrong optics at the wrong moment. Selene is the right optics, Julian said. Still light, still weighted. She's intelligent, she's self-made. She rehabilitates my public profile with a demographic the organization currently has no reach into. She is precisely calibrated for this moment. He said it in front of her. She sat and heard herself described as a calibrated instrument and kept her face completely still and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water moving through her chest, that Julian had not said it by accident. He'd said it in front of her deliberately to demonstrate to these men that she was manageable, that she operated within his control even when she could hear the mechanism. That was the message. She knows what this is and she stays anyway. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. After the meeting, in the elevator going down, Julian looked at the elevator doors and said nothing. She looked at them too. The city fell away behind the glass on the other side of the floor. Calibrated, she said. He looked at her. The elevator descended. Don't be sensitive. She looked back at the doors. I'm not. Good. He faced forward again. Sensitivity is a luxury. She breathed slow and even and said nothing. And the elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and she walked out into Midtown with the ring on her hand and the word calibrated sitting in her sternum like a swallowed stone. She called Kyle from a payphone on 48th Street. She hadn't used a payphone in 15 years. She'd found it and used it because she was beginning to understand that the level of operational care required here was significantly higher than anything she'd prepared for. He described me as calibrated in front of 8 board members, she said when Kyle picked up. He said I was precisely calibrated for this moment, in front of me, deliberately. That means you're past the evaluation stage, Kyle said immediately. He's committed, which means the timeline is moving faster than I thought. Faster toward what? A pause. Come to the house Thursday. There's something you need to see. What? Not on this line. Thursday. She hung up, stood on 48th Street in the gray October air, and watched cabs move up 7th Avenue, and thought about what it meant to be past the evaluation stage in a plan she didn't know all the pieces of. Thursday came, and Kyle met her in the estate's east garden, which was dead at this time of year, bare branches and frost-gray stone paths, and the particular cold desolation of wealthy outdoor spaces in November. He handed her a folder without preamble. She opened it. The first page was a financial document, account statements, wire transfers, asset movements, with her name on them. Her name. Selene Carter, listed as beneficial owner of 3 shell companies she had never heard of, with transactions totaling over $3 million across 14 months, beginning 4 months before Julian had walked into her studio. She looked at the pages until the words stopped moving. He's been building this since before he met me, she said. Since before he found you, Kyle said. You were selected. The studio, the Margaret Huang referral. He researched you for 8 weeks before he made contact. Clean background, no family money, no political connections. Somebody with no resources to fight back. He paused. The financial structure is designed to frame you for money laundering and fraud. Once you've outlived your usefulness, once the transition is complete and he doesn't need the public image anymore, these documents go to the FBI. She turned another page. A name she didn't recognize on a real estate transaction. Her name beside it as co-signatory on a document she had never signed. Her own signature, reproduced with the fidelity of someone who had spent time practicing it. He has my signature. He has everything. Your background, your patterns, your handwriting. He's been building the frame for over a year. Kyle's voice was flat. The Michelle Park murder gets added to it once she's no longer a loose end that can be explained away. At that point, you're the woman who helped cover it up. Selene closed the folder. Her hands were steady. She didn't know how they were steady, but they were. And Eli, she said. Kyle's jaw moved. Kyle. And Eli. Eli can identify me as the person who told him certain things, Kyle said. If this goes wrong, my father knows that. Julian knows it. He looked away from her toward the dead garden. Eli isn't safe in that house regardless of what we do. She stood in the cold and held the folder containing the architecture of her own destruction and felt something shifting in her chest, something that had been fear rearranging itself into something harder and less forgiving, something with edges rather than depths. I need access to the servers, she said. Yes. Julian's home office. He works from the estate on Fridays. I know his schedule. Then you know he leaves the office for the trainer at 11 and doesn't come back until 1. Kyle looked at her. You have 2 hours. Tell me exactly what I'm looking for, he told her. She listened with the focused attention of someone memorizing a route through unknown terrain. She asked 3 questions. He answered all 3. The dead garden held them in its November cold, and the house sat at their backs like something breathing. If this goes wrong, she said, it won't. Kyle. She turned and looked at him full on, the way she looked at rooms before she walked into them, reading everything available, filing everything findable. If this goes wrong, he met her eyes. The unreadable quality was still there, but underneath it she could now see, could now read, having spent enough time in the grammar of this family to understand what they suppressed and where. Something that was not calculation. Something older than calculation. Something close to the feeling of a person who had been sitting with a weight for so long they'd stopped being able to distinguish it from their own body. Then I make sure Eli gets out, he said. Whatever else happens. Eli gets out. She nodded. She went back inside. Friday came in with freezing rain that coated the Westchester roads in a translucent skin of ice and made the estate grounds look like something preserved under glass. Selene arrived at 9, as she had on 3 previous Fridays, with coffee and a tote bag and the specific casualness of someone performing routine. The security at the main gate checked her name against the list and waved her through. She had been on the list for 2 months. She was furniture. Julian kissed her in the front hallway and went back to his calls, and she walked through the house the way she always walked through it, greeting the housekeeper, checking in with Eli, establishing herself as present in the domestic geography so that nobody would think to track her specific movements within it. At 10:58, she walked to Julian's office door, knocked once, heard nothing, opened it. The room was empty. She went in, closed the door behind her, and stood for 3 seconds with her back against it, breathing. Her heart was doing the loud, unpleasant thing again. She let it. She couldn't stop it, so she let it and moved. The desktop computer was locked. She had expected that. What Kyle had given her was a USB drive loaded with a sequence he'd had prepared, a technical solution to the lock that she didn't fully understand and didn't need to. She plugged it in and watched the screen respond and stood beside the desk without sitting down, on the theory that a person about to run looks different standing than sitting. The access came in 40 seconds. The financial directory opened. She was looking at the records Kyle had described, the wire transfers, the shell accounts, the transaction histories that connected the Choi Corporation's legitimate revenue streams to the criminal operations underneath. And she was copying them, methodically, folder by folder, when she found the file that wasn't on Kyle's list. It was labeled with a date, 13 months ago. She opened it. It was a video file. She didn't want to open it. She opened it anyway because she was already past the point where not knowing was a protection. The footage was interior, low resolution, what looked like a basement room she didn't recognize. And in that room was a woman she had never met but recognized immediately from the single photograph Kyle had shown her. Dark hair, slight frame, a face that was trying very hard to maintain some core of composure in circumstances that were making composure nearly impossible. Michelle Park was alive in the footage, alive and terrified and talking to someone off camera in a voice that was trying not to shake and failing. And Julian's voice answered her, from off camera, in a tone Selene had heard before, the particular quietude of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply completing the necessary steps. The file was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. Selene stood in Julian Choi's office, in his father's house, in the freezing November rain, and she watched all 4 minutes and 17 seconds, because Michelle Park deserved at minimum to be witnessed, even now, even this late, by someone who would not look away. Then she copied the file, pulled the drive, and walked back out of the office with her hands completely steady and something permanently altered in the space behind her eyes. Some membrane of contingency that had still been intact that morning dissolved now and gone. The last possible version of a world where this was recoverable by ordinary means, where the right conversations with the right people would be sufficient. She walked down the hallway. She walked past the security camera. She smiled at the housekeeper. And she understood, with the cold finality of a door closing on its frame, that she was no longer gathering information. She was building a weapon. The only question left was whether she would survive long enough to use. She drove back to the Bronx in the freezing rain with the USB drive in her bra and Michelle Park's voice living inside her skull. Not the words. She couldn't have repeated the words with any accuracy. They'd passed through her in the way that extreme things pass through, too fast and too hot to be retained as language. Retained instead as sensation, as a specific quality of dread that had no name in any vocabulary she'd been given. What she retained was the tone, the particular register of a woman trying to maintain the outer shape of dignity while the inner structure collapsed. Selene knew that register. She'd heard it in her mother's voice years ago in a different kind of room. She'd worked very hard, across 34 years, never to produce it herself. She parked outside her building and sat in the car for 7 minutes. And then she went upstairs and she made tea. She didn't drink, and she sat at her kitchen table, and she went through everything she'd copied, file by file, on the small encrypted laptop Kyle had given her 3 weeks ago that she kept disassembled in 2 separate locations and only assembled in her kitchen with the windows covered. The financial evidence was comprehensive. Kyle had known what he was talking about. The records formed an unbroken chain from the Choi Corporation's legitimate revenue to shell accounts to criminal operations spanning 4 states and 3 countries. Tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering at a scale that suggested infrastructure rather than opportunism. And beneath all of it, in the oldest files, the records of what had happened to Jinsu Choi's wife 22 years ago in a car accident that the insurance company had paid out on and the local police department had closed inside of a week. She looked at all of it. She looked at Michelle Park's video file icon, and she did not open it again because once was what she could carry, and she was already carrying it. She called Kyle. "I have everything," she said. Silence. The servers? The servers and something else. A video file from 13 months ago, Kyle. She paused. He recorded it. Another silence, longer. She heard him breathe. I know about the file, he said. Everything in Selene's body went still. You know, I found a reference to it in the network logs 4 months ago. I couldn't access it from outside the system. A pause. I needed someone inside. She sat with that for 3 seconds. You knew what was on it. I suspected. Kyle. Her voice came out flat and very quiet. You sent me into that office knowing I might find a video of Julian murdering a woman. I sent you in to copy the financial records. His voice was steady, but not easy. If you found the file, I needed it copied. Yes. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the kitchen table, hard, feeling the wood grain against the pad of her thumb, grounding herself in the physical reality of the room. Was there anything else you suspected I might find that you chose not to mention? No? How certain are you of that? Selene, how certain? A pause. Certain. She breathed. She was furious. Not the hot, combustible kind of furious that burned through and left space behind it, but the slow, pressurized kind that had nowhere to go and simply accumulated. She tucked it away because there was no productive use for it right now and moved forward. The next step, she said. I have a federal contact, has been building a parallel case for 2 years but lacks the internal documentation. What you've copied fills the gap. He paused. I need to meet with him, physically. Not before I've had time to verify the integrity of the copied files. How long? 5 days. Maybe 6. 6 days. She looked at the window. The rain had thickened into something almost solid. Julian has a dinner at the estate Saturday. His father, some board members, a judge from... I know the dinner. He wants me there. Be there. Kyle's voice sharpened slightly. Be completely normal. Do not change anything. 6 days, Selene. 6 days, and I hand this to someone who can actually move on it. And Eli? I'll make arrangements for Eli separately, before the handoff. A pause. I have people I trust for that part. She almost said, do you, and didn't. She had just learned something about the cost of Kyle Choi's methods, and she was still metabolizing it, and there was no room right now to pick that particular lock. 6 days, she said. 6 days. She hung up and sat in her kitchen with the rain against the windows and the encrypted laptop in front of her, and she thought about the women in this story. Michelle, who hadn't made it, Jinsu's wife, who hadn't made it, and herself, who was still making it by the narrowest possible margin, and she felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but occupied the space where those two things met when they'd been living together long enough to stop distinguishing themselves. Then she opened the laptop and began making her own copies. Not for Kyle, not for the federal contact. Hers. Backed up to 3 separate encrypted servers in 3 separate countries using accounts that predated her involvement with the Choi family by years and were connected to nothing Julian had ever touched. She worked methodically for 2 hours, verifying each upload, each redundancy, each layer of access protection, and when she was done, she disassembled the laptop and put it back in its 2 locations and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed about the ring. In the dream, it was on the wrong hand and she couldn't get it off. Saturday came clear and cold, the kind of late November day that looked like winter had arrived in full and hadn't bothered to apologize. The estate was lit differently for the dinner, more interior light, warm against the early dark. The grounds illuminated by positioned lighting that made the property look like a stage set, which was essentially what it was. She wore a dress Julian had chosen. That had started 2 weeks ago, the dress selection, framed as care. I saw this and thought of you. And she had worn the first one without comment, and the second one without comment, and now she wore the third one and understood it as what it was. The costuming of a character he was directing. The dinner was 14 people. Julian's father at the head of the table, visibly diminished since the last time she'd seen him. The decline had accelerated in the past month, something happening in Jinsu Choi's body that expensive medicine could slow but not stop. His eyes, though. His eyes were exactly the same. Whatever was failing in him, it was not the faculty that assessed rooms and people and situations and assigned them their correct value within his operational framework. He watched Selene across the table with those eyes throughout the first course, and she met his gaze twice and looked away with the correct timing. Not avoidance, not challenge, the measured deference of a woman who respected the hierarchy without being erased by it. The judge was a man named Calloway. 70s, white-haired, the practiced social ease of someone who'd spent 4 decades being deferred to in rooms. He sat to Jin Su's right and ate carefully and said little, and when he did speak, it was in the considered minimal way of someone conserving authority rather than spending it. He knew what he was. Everyone at the table knew what he was. Nobody said it. 2 of the board members she recognized from the Midtown meeting. The others were new faces, older money, quieter money. The kind of men whose names appeared in the fine print of large transactions rather than on any public surface. Julian was performing. She could see it clearly now. The calibration of his warmth, the deployment of his attention around the table, the way he managed conversation flow with the invisible skill of someone who understood that controlling the room's energy was more valuable than controlling its content. He was very good. She had once found it attractive. Now she watched it the way you watched a mechanism, appreciating the engineering while remaining entirely clear about its purpose. After dinner, the men moved to the study. Selene stayed in the dining room with the 2 wives who had come, women she didn't know, women who had developed the specific self-containment of people who had spent years in proximity to power they didn't hold. She talked with them about nothing consequential and watched the study door and waited. Eli found her at 9:15. He appeared in the dining room doorway in his pajamas, which meant he'd been in bed and come down, which meant something had woken him or prevented him from sleeping. He looked at the 2 wives, then at Selene, with the precise calculation of a child assessing which adult in the room was safe. He crossed directly to Selene. "I need to tell you something," he said, quietly, meant only for her. She excused herself from the wives without hurrying and walked Eli into the adjacent sitting room and sat on the low ottoman so she was at his eye level and waited. He was holding something in his fist. He opened his hand and showed her a small USB drive, older looking, a piece of tape across it with handwriting so small she had to lean in. The handwriting said Eli, "For when you're ready." "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was completely even. "Mama hid it," he said, "a long time ago. In the binding of the book she gave me. I found it when the binding started coming apart." He looked at the drive in his palm. "She said in the note that I should give it to someone I trusted when I was ready." He looked up at Selene. "I'm ready." She looked at the drive. Michelle Park had hidden evidence. Had hidden it in a book she'd given to an 8-year-old boy, in a binding, with a note, against the possibility that she wouldn't be there to use it herself. She had planned for her own disappearance. She had been that afraid, and that lucid simultaneously, which was the particular combination that the most extraordinary acts of survival came from. Selene took the drive gently from Eli's hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "Is Mama okay?" She looked at him, at the dark, serious eyes and the hands tucked against his sides, and the pajamas with the small rocket ships on them, and the face of a child who had been waiting a very long time for an answer he already suspected. "I'm going to find out," she said. "I promise you." It was a real promise. She didn't make those lightly. She put Eli back to bed and sat with him until his breathing evened, which took 12 minutes, and she thought about what it cost a child to carry a secret for that long and deposit it into the hands of the first person he'd decided to trust. And she felt the weight of it settle into her alongside everything else she was carrying, and she accepted it and stood up and walked out. She found a bathroom, locked the door, and looked at the drive. She did not have the laptop. She had not brought it. Julian would have noticed. She held the drive in her palm and made a decision about the next 4 hours of her life and what they needed to contain. She had just made that decision when her phone buzzed. A text from Kyle. 2 words. "Call me." She called him from the bathroom, water running in the sink to cover her voice. "Something happened," Kyle said immediately. The cold came back. In the chest. Below the sternum. "What?" "The federal contact. He's gone dark." A pause that had things in it she couldn't fully read. "I reached out this afternoon for a check-in. His phone is disconnected. His office says he's on personal leave. Effective yesterday." She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror. Her own face looked back at her, composed, contained, the face she'd built and relied on, suddenly insufficient for what was underneath it. Personal leave, she repeated. It's possible it's coincidence. He didn't sound like he believed it. It's also possible Julian's legal infrastructure flagged my contact's case-building activity and leveraged the right people. Judge Calloway is in the study right now, she said. 12 feet from me. Silence. Kyle? She kept her voice very low. Was your contact the only federal connection? No, I have a backup, but the backup needs more time. The documentation I have isn't sufficient for them without the contact's existing case file, which I no longer have access to. How much more time? 2 weeks? Maybe 3, she breathed. I have 6 days of being a believable fiancé left in me. Maybe less. Julian is... She stopped, recalibrated. He's watching something. I don't know what. He's been looking at me differently for the past 4 days. Differently how? Like he's checking something against an expected result, and the result is slightly off. Another silence, heavier. Can you manage it? I've been managing it. The anger in her voice was controlled but present, and she let it be present because Kyle needed to hear it. I've been managing it under conditions you've been less than fully transparent with me about, and now the infrastructure I was relying on has collapsed, and I need to know right now if there is anything else you have not told me. Selene, anything else? A long pause. She watched herself in the mirror. Her jaw was tight. My father knows you've been in the office, Kyle said. The floor shifted under her. How long has he known? I found out tonight. One of the security staff, loyal to my father, not to Julian, saw you come out of the office. Told my father this afternoon. Kyle's voice was stripped of everything but information. My father hasn't told Julian yet. I don't know why. I don't know what he's planning to do with it. She turned off the water. I need to leave this dinner, she said. You can't leave. Leaving changes your behavior pattern. Julian notices behavior patterns. I'm aware of that. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for 1 second, a gesture she would not have made where anyone could see it. Kyle, your father is in that study, and he knows I've accessed Julian's files, and you're telling me I need to stay at this dinner and continue performing normalcy. Yes. For how long? Until it's over. Another 2 hours at most. And then you go home, and tomorrow you call me, and we figure out the next step with what we have. What we have is incomplete. I know. What we have is not enough to protect me legally if Julian decides to accelerate the frame. I know. A pause. Selene, I know, but right now the only move that doesn't immediately detonate everything is the one that looks like nothing has changed. She stood in the bathroom of the Choi estate with Michelle Park's hidden drive in one fist and the knowledge of her own exposure settling into her bones, like cold getting into old concrete, finding every crack and widening it. 2 hours, she said. 2 hours. She put the phone away, ran cold water over her wrists, dried her hands, and looked at herself in the mirror one more time with the full understanding that the woman looking back at her needed to walk back out into that dining room and spend 2 more hours being Julian Choi's fiancée in a house where his father knew she'd been in his files. She rolled her shoulders once, a small private motion no one would ever see. Then she unlocked the door and went back out. The next hour and 40 minutes were the most demanding performance of her professional life, and she had spent 14 years teaching other people how to perform. She talked. She laughed. She touched Julian's arm at the right moments. She said goodnight to Julian Choi, and when the old man's eyes met hers, she held his gaze with exactly the correct amount of warmth and exactly the correct amount of deference, and she felt him reading her, and she let him read exactly what she intended and no more. She did not know if it was enough. She drove home at 11:15. She was 4 blocks from the estate when the black SUV pulled in behind her. It had been there since the gate. She'd noted it at the gate and filed it under security standard behavior because the estate regularly ran tail vehicles on guests with close family access. She had filed it and kept driving and watched it in her mirrors, and it was still there at the first turn, and still there at the second, and still there when she hit the main road. And that was when she understood it was not standard. She kept her speed exactly at the limit. She drove for 6 miles, changing direction twice in ways that could be explained as alternate route choices, and the SUV stayed with her through both changes, neither closing nor dropping back, maintaining a distance that was professional, not following the way an amateur followed, too close, too obvious, but following the way someone who knew exactly where she lived followed because they didn't need to keep visual contact to know where she was going. Her phone rang. "Julian," she answered. "Just checking you got out okay," he said. Roads looked icy. "I'm fine," she said. "Almost home." "Good." A pause. "I'll call you tomorrow. We need to talk about the announcement timeline. My father wants to move the public engagement announcement up." "How far up?" "End of the month." Another pause. "He was very taken with you tonight, Selene. He said," and here his voice carried something she couldn't categorize, almost pride, almost satisfaction. "He said you were exactly what this family needed right now." "That's kind of him," she said. "It's not kindness, it's assessment. The familiar weight in the lightness. He doesn't give compliments, he gives evaluations. I understand the difference." "I know you do." A brief silence. "Sleep well." He hung up. She drove the remaining 8 blocks to her building and parked and sat for a moment watching the mirror. The SUV had stopped half a block back, engine running, and sat there, patient, doing nothing. She went upstairs. She assembled the laptop, plugged in Michelle Park's drive, and opened the contents. There were 47 files. Text documents, audio recordings, photographs, and one additional video that was not the basement room. This one was an office she recognized, Jinsu's study, recorded covertly with a device she couldn't identify the placement of. The audio was imperfect, degraded in stretches, but clear enough for the content to be unmistakable. Clear enough to hear Jinsu and Julian discussing Michelle's exposure of the financial records she'd found, discussing what needed to happen as a consequence, discussing it in the specific rational pragmatic tones of men solving a logistical problem rather than ending a life. Clear enough to hear Julian say in a voice she had heard say, "I love you and you're extraordinary and exactly what I needed. How long do we need to wait before it becomes a problem?" And Jinsu's answer, thoughtful, deliberate. 2 days, no more. Michelle Park had recorded her own death sentence. She had documented it, hidden it, and trusted it to an 8-year-old boy wrapped in a book binding because she had understood, with complete lucidity, that the only thing powerful enough to survive what was coming for her was evidence, and the only person in that house innocent enough to be trusted with it was the child who wasn't a Choi by blood. Selene sat with all 47 files and the weight of everything they contained, and she felt something inside her, some remaining membrane of hope that this could be resolved through the correct channels, through Kyle's contact, through the slow, legitimate machinery of justice, finally, irrevocably dissolve. The channels had been compromised. The contacts had gone dark. The timeline had been accelerated. The security tail was outside her building. And Jinsu Choi knew she'd been in the office. She was not going to get 3 weeks. She was not going to get 1 week. She had what she had right now, tonight, in this apartment, and whatever she was going to do with it needed to be decided before morning, because morning was not guaranteed to be a morning where she still had the ability to make choices. She loaded every file from both drives onto every backup server she had. She wrote 12 separate cover emails to 12 separate addresses, journalists, a federal prosecutor she'd researched independently months ago before any of this started, 3 civil rights attorneys, an investigative news desk, 4 individual reporters with documented records of covering organized crime. She did not send them. She set them up, queued, with a time delay send 48 hours out, contingent on her not logging into the specific account and canceling the sends within that window. If she was still free and functional in 48 hours, she canceled them and retained control. If she wasn't, they sent themselves. Then she sat back and looked at what she had and understood what she was actually looking at. She wasn't building a case anymore. She wasn't gathering evidence for someone else to act on. She had become, in the past 6 hours, the single most dangerous person to the Choi family's survival. And she had done it unilaterally, without backup, without institutional support, with nothing between her and the full operational weight of a 40-year criminal organization except her own intelligence and a set of encrypted servers, and the specific kind of will that accumulated in women who had spent their entire lives being told they had no leverage. She had leverage. The question was whether she survived long enough to use it. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from an unknown number, 3 digits she didn't recognize, a number that hadn't contacted her before. The text contained 4 words. My father wants to meet. She stared at the screen. Not Kyle. The number was different, but the message was in English, sent at 1:47 in the morning, from a number she didn't recognize. And it was either Kyle operating through a different device, or it was something else entirely, a third vector she hadn't accounted for, a play being made from a position she couldn't see. She thought about Julian Choi's eyes across the dinner table, the evaluation in them, the specific quality of his attention, the way it had been focused not just on who she was, but on what she knew and how she was carrying it. She thought about what it meant that Jinsu had learned about the office and had not told Julian. She thought about Kyle's voice saying, I don't know what he's planning to do with it. She looked at the text, and she understood, with the sudden full-body clarity of a person who has been reading a situation wrong and finally sees the correct reading, that Julian Choi was not preparing to eliminate her. He was preparing to use her, for something, against someone. The geometry wasn't visible yet, but the pattern was there, the same pattern she'd spent 14 years teaching people to recognize. The powerful person in the room who appears to be passive and is in fact the one directing everything, including the person who thinks they're directing everything, including Julian. The thought arrived with the force of something large and fast moving through a small space, including Julian. She typed back, when and where. The reply came in 11 seconds. Tomorrow. Noon. Come alone. The address was in Manhattan. She looked it up. A private medical facility on the Upper East Side. Not the estate. Not any location connected to the Choi Corporation. A private address. A quiet address. The kind of address that suggested a man who wanted this conversation to happen outside the awareness of everyone who worked for him, including his son. Selene put the phone down. She looked at her kitchen table, at the assembled laptop, at the 2 small drives sitting beside it, at the coffee she still hadn't drunk that had gone cold an hour ago. She thought about all the plans she'd made and all the ways they had come apart, and she thought about what it meant to walk into a dying patriarch's private meeting, alone, without backup, and without the infrastructure she'd been relying on. And she thought about Michelle Park, hidden in a book binding waiting to be found by the right person. She thought about Eli's face when he'd put the drive in her hand. I'm ready. She picked up the phone and looked at the address again. Then she opened a new document on the encrypted laptop, and she began to write, quickly, everything she knew. She wrote for 2 hours. Everything. Chronological, specific, documented. Not the emotional version, not the version that lived in her chest and tasted like iron, but the operational version. The version that named dates and times and locations, and the specific content of specific conversations, and the specific files on the specific drives and where every backup server was, and what every queued email contained and how to access all of it. She wrote it as if she were writing instructions for someone who had never met her, and would never meet her, and would need to complete the work without her present to explain any of it. She printed 2 copies on the small printer she kept in her closet, folded them, sealed them in 2 envelopes, addressed them to 2 different people who were not Kyle and not any contact Kyle had given her. One was a law professor she'd met at a conference 3 years ago who had spent a career studying organized crime prosecution. The other was a woman journalist she had followed for a decade, who had published 4 investigations on financial crime and had survived 2 credible threats against her without retraction. She did not mail the letters that night. She held them and decided she would mail them in the morning from 2 different mailboxes before the noon meeting. Then she disassembled the laptop, put both drives in separate pockets of her jacket, and slept for 4 hours on her back with her shoes on, which was not something she'd done since she was 19 and sleeping in a shelter for 6 weeks after aging out of the foster system. And the fact that her body accepted it without complaint told her something about how far she'd come back around to the beginning. She woke at 6. She ran 2 miles in the dark, and the cold because she needed her body coherent, and running had always been the mechanism for that. The body too occupied with the basic demands of oxygen and forward motion to spiral. She showered. She dressed in clothes she chose herself, charcoal trousers, a dark wool sweater, flat boots she could move in. Nothing Julian had selected, nothing that belonged to the character she'd been performing. She mailed the letters at 7:15 from 2 mailboxes 4 blocks apart. Then she went to her studio and taught 2 sessions, back to back. A corporate client working on his board presentation posture, and a 17-year-old girl who'd won a scholarship to a school full of people who looked nothing like her and needed to learn not to apologize for her presence with her body before she'd said a word. Selene was fully present for both of them. Whatever was happening at noon, these people had paid her and shown up. And that mattered in its own right. And she did not believe in doing work badly because the rest of your life was on fire. At 10:30, she locked the studio and took the subway to the Upper East Side and walked the last 6 blocks, noting the 2 people who stayed with her for more than 3 blocks, noting the one who peeled off at the second turn and the one who didn't. She walked a deliberate, unnecessary block out of her way, and the remaining tail followed it, and she filed it and kept moving because there was nothing to do about it, and the meeting was already the most dangerous variable in play, not the surveillance. The medical facility was on East 68th, unmarked except for a small brass number plate, the kind of place that didn't need advertising because its clientele didn't find it through advertising. She gave her name to the front desk. The woman there nodded without checking anything and took her directly to a private room on the 3rd floor. Julian Choi was smaller in this context than he'd been in the estate. Not weaker, the eyes were the same, but diminished by the medical environment the way powerful men sometimes were, surrounded by equipment and tubes and the visible evidence of a body in the process of losing its negotiation with time. He was in a bed but sitting up, dressed not in a hospital gown but in a dark sweater and trousers, which she understood as a deliberate choice, an insistence on the retained form of authority even when the substance was eroding. There was one chair beside the bed. She sat in it. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back. "You found more than the financial records," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Michelle's files." "Yes." He absorbed this without visible reaction, which was what she'd expected. "And the video from the office." "Both of them," she said. Something moved very briefly across his face. Not guilt, nothing as simple as guilt, but something in the same tonal register as a man who has made a calculation that was correct in all its parts and is now confronting the sum. "How much have you distributed?" "Enough that it can't be retrieved." "To whom?" "People outside your operational reach." She kept her voice level, informational. "And outside Kyle's." That landed. He was still for 3 seconds longer than he'd been still before. "You don't trust my son." "I trust Kyle to want the right outcome," she said. "I don't trust any member of your family not to make decisions about my survival based on what's most useful at any given moment. Those are different things." Jinsu looked at her with those evaluation eyes and said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the city made its sounds. Someone in another room coughed. The heating system in the wall ticked. "I didn't call you here to threaten you," he said. "I know." "You know. You've known about the office for 3 days. If you wanted me threatened or removed, you would have done it differently and earlier." She paused. "You called me here because something has changed in what you want from the situation. I don't know yet what's changed or why, but I know it's not what I came to this family for." He studied her. "Julian is moving faster than I authorized." She waited. The transition was supposed to be managed, gradual, certain, liabilities addressed cleanly, no exposure, no instability. His voice was measured, controlled, but beneath the control was something she hadn't heard from him before. The faint signature of a man who has recognized that something he built has exceeded his ability to direct it. Julian has developed his own timeline, his own methods. In the past 8 months, he has made decisions I did not sanction. "Michelle Park." A pause. "Among others." "Your wife," she said. The room got very quiet. Jinsu Choi looked at her with an expression that was not what she'd expected. Not anger, not denial, but something closer to the face of a man looking at a wound that had been there so long he'd stopped registering it as pain, and had only just been reminded that wounds of that kind did not stop existing because you stopped acknowledging them. "You found the old files," he said. "They were in Michelle's collection." Michelle was thorough. He said it with something that might have been respect if it weren't for everything else it was adjacent to. "She was trying to survive," Selene said. She collected everything she could find because she understood what the alternative looked like. She paused. She didn't make it, but she was thorough. Silence. He looked at the window. "What do you want from me?" he said. Not confrontational, genuinely asking. "I want to understand why you called this meeting. I want you to testify." He looked back at her. "Against Julian, to whatever federal authority is currently building the case." She held very still. "Why?" "Because Julian is going to destroy this family's legacy. Because what I built, however you judge it, whatever it was mine. And what he's doing is not management, it's arson, and he will burn it to the ground and everyone in proximity." He paused. "And because what happened to Michelle was not what I authorized, and I have been carrying that differently than I anticipated." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not remorse," she said. "That's regret about the method." "Yes," he said, without flinching. "That's correct. I am not asking you to mistake me for something I'm not. I am asking you to recognize that our interests have converged." She breathed, in, then out. "What about Kyle?" "Kyle's federal contact didn't go dark because Julian moved against him," Jinsu said. "He went dark because I moved against him. I needed the existing case paused while I negotiated the terms of my own cooperation." The cold in her chest spread outward. "You burned your own son's case." "I created space for a different arrangement." He reached to the bedside table and lifted a single piece of paper, handwritten, and held it out to her. "The name of a federal prosecutor who has been waiting for my direct cooperation for 11 months. Someone Julian cannot reach. Someone I have confirmed is clean." A pause. "I was waiting for the correct leverage. You've delivered it." She looked at the paper. She did not take it yet. "And Eli," she said. "Eli leaves the house before anything is activated," Jinsu said. "I will arrange it." "I've already arranged it," she said, "through Kyle." "Kyle doesn't know what's coming." He said it carefully. "Kyle knows enough to be useful and not enough to interfere. That is deliberate." She sat in the chair beside a dying man who had ordered murders and built empires on blood and was now offering her a road through the wreckage he'd created, and she thought about what it meant to use a tool built by hands she couldn't trust. She thought about Michelle's 47 files. She thought about the queued emails 42 hours from now. She took the paper. She looked at the name. She committed it to memory and folded the paper and put it in her pocket. "If you're working me," she said, "the same way Julian worked me, if I were working you," Jinsu said, "you would not be in this room. You would not be anywhere." He held her gaze. "I am an old man who is dying and who has recently developed the interest of a man who can see the end of things in understanding how the things he built will be remembered." He paused. "That is not goodness. I am not offering you goodness. I am offering you accuracy." She stood up. "I'll contact the prosecutor," she said, "on my terms, through my channels. If the arrangement is what you say it is, it will hold without your management." He nodded once. She walked to the door. "Miss Carter." She turned. "The ceremony is in 9 days," he said. "The ancestral succession ceremony. Julian has moved it up in anticipation of my death. The entire organization will be present." He looked at her with the full weight of everything he was and everything he'd done, and whatever remained of whatever he'd once intended. "Whatever you're planning, whatever set, whatever shape it takes, that room will contain every significant element of what needs to be addressed. All in one place. One moment." She looked at him. 9 days, she said. 9 days. She left. She was on the sidewalk outside the facility, walking north with the cold air against her face, when her phone rang. Julian. She answered on the second ring. "Where are you?" he said. The tone was different, not the performed warmth. Something underneath the warmth, something she'd heard briefly before, in the boardroom, the calibrated comment, in the bathroom's fluorescent honesty, something stripped of the social engineering. "Errands," she said. "Upper East Side." "Where are you?" "Come to the estate. Today. My father wants you there." "I was just with your father." A silence that lasted 2 full seconds. "What did you say?" She heard it. The shift. The controlled velocity of a man who has just received information that changes his calculation of a situation. She'd said it deliberately. She needed him to know she'd been to see Jinsu. She needed Julian to understand that Jinsu had made a separate move, because what happened next required Julian to feel the ground shifting under him rather than solidifying, and the only way to create that was to let him see that his father had gone around him. "He asked me to come," she said, keeping her voice casual. "I didn't mention it because I didn't want you to read things into a private conversation with a sick man." "What did he say to you?" "He asked about the engagement announcement. He wanted to give me something that had been his wife's." She let a pause develop. "Julian, what's going on?" "Nothing. Flat, hard. I'll pick you up at 7. He hung up. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking and felt the machinery of the next 9 days beginning to move, gears finding each other in the dark. The whole construction beginning its acceleration toward a fixed point she had not yet fully mapped but could now, for the first time, see. She spent the next 3 days performing. The performance was the most technically demanding work of her life, and it required her to hold 2 complete and contradictory operational realities in her mind simultaneously. The Julian-facing reality, in which she was his fiancée, compliant and warm and slightly overwhelmed by the pace of the family's events, and the actual reality, in which she was in contact with a federal prosecutor named Anita Walsh, who had, upon receiving her initial encrypted message, responded within 4 hours with the specific operational language of someone who had been waiting for exactly this contact and was not interested in wasting time. Walsh was lean and fast in her communications, minimal, precise. She asked for specific documents, specific dates, specific names, and she asked for them in an order that told Selene she was building toward a particular architectural conclusion. Selene delivered everything. She delivered it in pieces, through encrypted channels, between sessions at the studio, between dinners at the estate, between the long, careful hours of being Julian's fiancée, in front of people who needed to see her be exactly that. She told Kyle on day 4. She met him in Mott Haven again, same parking structure, same level, same positions, and she told him about the meeting with Jinsu, and about Walsh, and about the queued emails, and about everything she'd done that he didn't know. She told him cleanly, without apology, and she watched his face move through what she said, and she saw the anger, genuine anger, not performed, the real thing. The anger of a man who has been worked around by every senior person in his life and has the specific exhaustion of someone who has run out of ways to be surprised by it. "My father played me," he said. "Your father played everyone, including Julian, if his read on the ceremony is correct." She looked at him steadily. "Kyle, I'm telling you now because I need you present at the ceremony, and I need you to know the full picture before you walk into that room." "What are you planning?" "To expose everything, publicly, during the ceremony, in front of everyone who matters to the organization's survival." The parking structure held them in its gray concrete cold. Kyle looked at her with the comprehensive cataloging eyes, and she let him look because there was nothing there she needed to hide from him anymore. "You'll need access to the audio-visual system," he said. "I know. I can get that. I know. If Julian figures it out before you play it, I know what Julian will do." She held his gaze. "I need you in the room, and I need you armed, and I need you to make a decision before we walk in there about who you are when it ends." Kyle was quiet for a long moment. The city sounds filtered up from below. Someone's radio, briefly, then gone. "He's my brother," he said. "I know. And he's what I've been building a case against for 14 months. "I know." She paused. "Those aren't contradictory. They're both true. The question is which one you act on when the moment comes." He looked away. The muscle in his jaw moved. He stood in the parking structure in Mott Haven with his scarred hands in his pockets and his weight forward and his face carrying everything the Choi name had cost him, and she watched him arrive at whatever place he arrived at and come back with it settled. "I'll be there," he said. "That's all I'm asking." The night before the ceremony, she didn't sleep at all. She sat at her kitchen table with the assembled laptop, and she went through everything one more time, every file, every piece of evidence, the video from the office, Michelle's recordings, the financial documents, the succession of wire transfers and shell accounts, and concealed murders that constituted the operational history of a family that had been consuming people for 40 years. She built the presentation sequence she intended to use, ordered for maximum impact, beginning with the financial evidence that implicated every man in that room and ending with Michelle's voice and Julian's answer and the specific 8 words that made it unambiguous. She set up the remote trigger on her phone. One button connected to the estate's audio-visual system via an access code Kyle had sent her that afternoon, and connected to the full distribution list: journalists, prosecutor, attorneys, news desk. With a different tap, a second button, a redundancy she had built because she had learned in this experience that single-channel plans were for people who had more infrastructure than she did. She thought about everything that could go wrong. She listed it systematically. For each item, she identified the response and the fallback. Some of the fallbacks were inadequate. She accepted that. Some situations had no adequate fallback, and what you did in those situations was move through them as accurately as possible and take the result. She thought about Michelle Park. She thought about this book binding and the note and the 8-year-old boy who had carried it for months because he was waiting for someone he trusted. She thought about Eli's voice. "I'm ready." She got up at 5, ran 3 miles, came back, showered, and dressed in the suit she had chosen 3 days ago. Her own, dark navy, severe, the suit she wore when she needed rooms to understand immediately that she was not decoration. She did not wear the ring. She had not worn it in 2 days, and Julian had not mentioned it, which told her something about where Julian's attention was currently directed. She arrived at the estate at 8:30, which was 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, because she needed those 30 minutes to be inside the building and moving through it before the arriving guests locked the geometry. The estate was different. The security density was higher than she'd ever seen it. Armed personnel at every entry, at the interior checkpoints, along the hallways, cars filling the circular drive. Faces she recognized and faces she didn't. The operational network of the Choi family made briefly physical and visible, all of it converging on the ceremonial hall where Julian was about to be crowned. She moved through it all with her chin level and her pace even, and she greeted the people she knew and nodded to the ones she didn't. And she walked directly to the ceremonial hall and took her position. The hall was a circular chamber in the estate's original wing, the oldest part of the building, with a high ceiling painted in dark tones and walls lined with the accumulated portraiture of the Choi family across 3 generations. The ancestral altar at the room's center was old, dark lacquered wood, ceremonially dressed, the kind of object that had been moved carefully across decades and carried the weight of that care. Seating had been arranged in concentric circles around it, standing positions along the walls. When the room filled, it held 63 people: politicians, board members, judges, associates, the full operational range of what Jin-Soo Choi had spent 40 years building, assembled to watch his son inherit it. Julian stood at the altar in ceremonial black, and he was beautiful in the way that certain lethal things were beautiful. Precise, purposeful, constructed entirely for effect, and carrying beneath the surface an absolute commitment to outcome that had no negotiating position and no stopping condition. He caught her eye across the room and smiled. The slow smile, the rehearsed one, the one she had once believed and now read like a text in a language she'd finally decoded. She smiled back. She had her phone in her jacket pocket. Her thumb knew where the first button was. Jin-Soo was brought in on a wheelchair, which was the first time she had seen him use one, and the room absorbed this information. The patriarch diminished enough to be wheeled, with the particular collective recalibration of a group of people updating their power maps in real time. He was seated to the left of the altar. His face was the usual face, the evaluation face, the face that gave nothing and observed everything. His eyes found hers across the room. He did not change expression. She did not change expression. The ceremony began. Julian spoke first. A prepared address to the assembled organization, formal in its register, pitched to a room of people who needed to believe they were witnessing legitimacy rather than transition, that this was earned continuation rather than raw seizure. He spoke for 12 minutes, and he was exceptional at it. She watched the room while he spoke, and she watched the room believe him, or perform belief, which in rooms like this was the same functional thing. A board member spoke, then a man she didn't know who appeared to represent the older operational networks, speaking in formal language about continuity and strength and the preservation of what had been built. Then Julian returned to the altar for the succession acknowledgement, the formal component, the moment the ceremony had been structured to deliver, and the room's energy shifted into the particular held breath quality of collective witnessing. Julian raised the ceremonial cup from the altar. He began to speak the words of the succession ritual, which she recognized from the preparation Kyle had given her, and his voice carried in the circular chamber with the acoustic authority of a space designed to make voices carry. And 63 people watched him take the cup and prepare to seal the moment. Selene pressed the first button. The sound came from everywhere simultaneously because the hall's audio system was distributed, and Kyle had given her access to all of it. The sound was Michelle Park's voice, terrified and trying not to show it, and behind it Julian's voice, calm and procedural, and behind that the specific ambient quality of a basement room, and 63 people in a ceremonial hall heard it come out of the walls around them in the middle of a succession ritual, and the collective breath of the room broke. Julian's head turned. His eyes found her across the room, and what was in them was not surprise. Surprise was not a thing Julian Choi was capable of in the traditional sense, but it was something adjacent, the look of a man who has run a calculation that was supposed to be complete and has discovered a variable he did not account for, and the look of a man who now has to decide in real time what the revised calculation produces. She held his gaze. She did not look away. On the massive screens that flanked the altar, screens that had been set up for the visual components of the ceremony, for the organizational documentation Julian had planned to display, the financial records appeared now instead. Wire transfers, shell accounts, names, numbers, the unbroken chain of 40 years of criminal revenue in readable columns on screens 60 people could see simultaneously. The room erupted, not all at once. It broke in sections, the way structural failures broke, one point of contact and then the propagation. Board members rising from their seats, the judge's face going white and rigid, voices overlapping in the specific chaos register of powerful people confronting unexpected public exposure. People near the exits moving toward them, people near the center of the room frozen by the dual instinct to flee and to assess whether fleeing was itself a visible admission. Julian moved. He moved fast, faster than she'd expected, which meant she'd underestimated him even now, even at this stage, which was a lesson she was receiving in real time with no opportunity to apply it retroactively. He crossed the hall floor in 8 strides, and he had her arm before she registered the distance closing, and the grip was not the grip of a man performing restraint. It was direct and hard, and the pain was immediate, and she didn't make a sound. "Stop it," he said, right at her ear, low and precise. "Stop it right now." "It's already running," she said. All of it, to everyone." "You're going to tell me how to shut it down." "I'm not going to tell you that." The grip tightened. The pain moved up into her shoulder. She absorbed it because she had no other option, and because showing it to him was a currency she was not spending. The audio of Michelle's recording was still running from the walls. The financial records were still on the screens. The room was in full fragmentation now. The coherent social fabric of the gathered organization dissolved entirely. Security personnel unsure who to respond to or how when the crisis was distributed through every wall and ceiling. "Julian," a voice from her left, measured, controlled. Kyle, standing 8 feet away, with his jacket open. "Let her go." Julian's breathing was audible now, close at her ear, the first genuinely uncontrolled thing she had ever experienced from him. The breath of a man whose calculation had been destroyed in front of an audience and who was processing the loss of control through the only remaining mechanism he had. "You." He said it at Kyle without releasing Selene. "You set this up." "Let her go," Kyle said again. "You brought her in. You turned her into this." The grip shifted. Selene felt metal against her jaw, the hard, precise geometry of a gun barrel, and the room's ambient noise dropped as the people immediately surrounding them registered what they were looking at. "You made my own family into a weapon against me." "It wasn't me," Kyle said. His voice was completely flat. His eyes were on Julian's face, not on Selene's, which she understood. He was reading Julian's decision-making process through his expression, tracking it the way you tracked an unstable weight for the direction it was going to fall. "She did it herself. She's been 3 steps ahead of both of us the entire time." "Shut up! You picked a woman who was smarter than you and more determined than you, and you put her inside your house." Kyle took 1 step forward, stopped. "That's not on me, Julian." The gun pressed harder against her jaw. In her pocket, her thumb was on the second button. The distribution list. The redundancy. The one that sent everything to everyone in a package complete enough to stand without any additional action on her part. The package that made her survival operationally irrelevant to the evidence's delivery because the evidence would be delivered regardless. She had not pressed it yet. She was deciding whether to press it. From across the room, from the wheelchair near the altar, Julian Choi said one word. Julian. The sound of the father's voice, diminished in body, but not in the specific frequency that communicated authority to the particular neural pathways that authority had been conditioning since childhood, hit Julian with visible physical impact. The grip changed. The gun stayed, but something in his posture shifted, a micro-reorientation toward the source of the voice, the specific involuntary reflex of decades of hierarchical conditioning. Jinsu spoke again, in Korean this time, short and direct. And she didn't know the words, but she knew the register. The voice of a man giving a final command from a position of absolute and diminishing authority, the kind of command that had no request in it and no discussion. Julian's breathing changed. The gun came away from her jaw by 3 inches. In that 3 inches of altered geometry, Selene read everything that was about to happen in the next 90 seconds, and made the only decision available that did not end with her blood on the ceremonial hall floor. She drove her elbow back into Julian's ribcage with the specific mechanical precision of a woman who had been running 3 miles every morning for 6 years, and whose body was a great deal more capable than Julian had bothered to assess. Because Julian Choi had spent his entire life surrounded by people who didn't push back physically, and had developed, underneath the polished surface, the specific muscular overconfidence of a man who had never been hit by someone who meant it. She meant it. He went sideways. The gun discharged. The sound in the circular chamber was enormous, acoustic, bouncing off the high ceiling and the old walls and the 63 assembled witnesses of the Choi succession ceremony, and in the silence that followed the sound, 1 full second of collective held breath, Selene pressed the second button. The distribution sent. The redundancy activated. Everything went to everyone, time-stamped, unalterable, 47 files, and 2 video recordings, and 14 months of financial documentation, and Michelle Park's voice, and Julian's answer, and Jinsu Choi's 8 words about the timeline, and the complete operational history of a criminal organization in the moment of its most visible and witnessed disintegration. Outside the estate gates, the first federal vehicle arrived. She heard the siren from inside the hall. Julian was on the floor. She didn't know if he'd been shot or had gone down from the impact. She hadn't looked. She had moved. She had put space between herself and him the way you put space between yourself and the most dangerous thing in your proximity. And she was now 8 feet away with the room between them and Kyle, between her and Julian and 63 people in various states of flight and frozen panic around the altar where the ancestral portraits of 3 generations of Choi family stared down at the wreckage of what they'd built. She looked at the screen above the altar. Michelle Park's voice had stopped. The audio had run its length and finished. What remained on the screen now was the documentation, the records, the evidence, the unignorable and distributed and undeniably public accounting of a family that had spent 40 years believing itself untouchable. She looked at Julian on the floor. He was alive. She could see his chest moving. He was bleeding from somewhere she couldn't precisely locate. His face turned away from her, one hand pressed flat against the ceremonial floor as if he was trying to push himself up and the strength was not arriving. He turned his head and looked at her. And the look was the thing she would carry, the thing she would return to in the months ahead, in the still hours when the magnitude of what she'd done arrived in full, the thing that no amount of correct decision-making could entirely prepare you for, was not the look she'd expected. It was not rage, and it was not calculation. It was the look of a man who has been completely and finally seen, stripped of every layer of construction, and who finds in that total exposure something he had not anticipated, the recognition of his own emptiness. The specific horror of looking at what you actually are when everything you've built yourself to appear as has been removed. He looked at her with that face for 3 seconds, then his eyes closed. The hall doors came open with the specific force of people who did not. The hall doors came open with the specific force of people who did not knock. Tactical agents in body armor moved through the entry points in the coordinated geometry of a team that had been staged outside and waiting for the signal that had just arrived in the form of 47 distributed files and 1 gunshot and 63 witnesses to a succession ceremony that would be described in federal filings for the next decade. They moved fast, and they moved with the compressed professionalism of people who had prepared for exactly this room and exactly this moment, and the effect on the assembled guests was immediate and total. The remaining frozen ones broke, and the ones who had been moving for exits reversed course when they found agents already at the exits, and the circular hall contracted into a controlled space in under 40 seconds. Selene did not move. She stood in the position she had been standing in when the doors came open, 8 feet from Julian's body on the floor, and she watched the room be taken, and she breathed in and out, and she kept her hands visible at her sides because she understood that in a room with this many weapons and this much adrenaline, the most important thing a person could communicate was that they were not a variable. An agent reached her in 30 seconds. Young, female, her face carrying the focused blankness of someone running a protocol. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "No. I need you to come with me." "I know." She went. They took her to one of the estate's ground floor reception rooms that had been converted in the past 20 minutes into a staging area. Chairs, a folding table, 2 agents with laptops, the improvised infrastructure of a federal operation that had moved faster than its physical preparation. She sat in the chair they indicated, and she answered the initial questions: name, identification, confirmation that she was Selene Carter and that she had initiated the distribution of the evidence files. And she did all of it with the flatness of someone who has expended every available reserve of performance and has arrived at a place beyond effect where the only thing left is accuracy. Anita Walsh arrived 40 minutes later. She was shorter than Selene had imagined, which was the thing you always noticed first about people you'd known only through their professional communications. The specific dissonance between the voice you'd constructed and the body it lived in. Walsh was compact, precise, with close-cropped hair, and the eyes of a woman who had spent 20 years in rooms that lied to her and had developed, as a consequence, a form of attention that processed everything at once, rather than sequentially. She looked at Selene the way Selene looked at rooms, reading the whole before the parts. She sat across from her without preamble. "The files are intact," Walsh said. "All distribution points confirmed receipt. The financial documentation is sufficient for 31 federal charges across 4 jurisdictions." She paused. "The video evidence regarding Michelle Park's death will require forensic authentication, but preliminary review confirms its evidentiary value." "Michelle Park," Selene said. "Has her family been notified?" "That's being processed." Walsh looked at her steadily. "You retained independent backup copies?" "Yes." "Not connected to any of Kyle Choi's infrastructure?" "Correct." "That was smart?" Walsh said it without particular warmth, the way you noted accurate engineering. "If Jinsu Choi's people had moved against you before tonight, the independent copies would have been the only surviving chain of custody." "That was the logic." Walsh looked at her for another moment. "Are you actually all right?" It was a different question from the agent's question. The agent had been asking about physical injury. Walsh was asking about something else, the thing underneath the physical, the thing that didn't show in the places where medical personnel looked. Selene looked back at her and considered answering it honestly. "Ask me in a month," she said. Walsh nodded once. She looked like a person who understood that answer completely. Julian was alive. She learned this from an agent who came through the reception room 40 minutes into the processing and spoke briefly to Walsh, and Walsh relayed it to her with the neutral informational delivery of someone who understood that the answer had weight but did not assume to know how much. The gunshot had passed through his left side, missing the lung by a margin the paramedics described as significant, and he had lost substantial blood on the ceremonial floor of his ancestral hall. And he was in surgery at a Westchester hospital, with 2 federal agents stationed outside the door. Selene received this information. She sat with it. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which had been either relief or its absence, the binary she'd been preparing for. What she felt was more complicated and less dramatic, something closer to the feeling of a load-bearing wall finally being taken out of a structure you'd been moving carefully around for months, and discovering that the building didn't collapse. It just stood there, differently, missing the thing it had organized itself around. She thought about the ring, which she'd left on her kitchen table that morning. She thought about the slow smile that had arrived in the doorway of her studio on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "My name is Julian Choi," and she thought about the specific quality of her own hope in that moment, real hope, unguarded, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in years, and she thought about what it cost to have that used as the point of entry for something built entirely to consume her. She sat with that cost for a while. Then she put it away, not because it wasn't real, and not because it didn't matter, but because she had learned, across 34 years of needing to keep moving, that the things you put away weren't the things you discarded. They were the things you carried differently, closer to the center, where they stopped being weights and started being architecture. They let her go at 2 a.m, not free. There would be days of formal interviews ahead, depositions, the long procedural machinery of federal prosecution that would take months to run its course and would require her presence and her testimony and her willingness to sit in rooms and be cross-examined by people paid to find the holes in what she'd done. She understood that. She had understood it going in. But at 2 a.m, they gave her back her jacket and her phone and told her she was not being detained, and she walked out of the Choi estate through the front door for the last time. The circular drive was chaos made orderly by federal procedure. Vehicles at angles, personnel in clusters, the estate's security staff in zip-tie restraints along the stone wall, the guests who had not already been processed sitting in the backs of vehicles or standing in supervised groups looking at the house they'd been inside 2 hours ago with the particular stunned quality of people for whom the geometry of power has just been visibly rearranged. She walked through all of it, and none of it touched her. Kyle was standing at the outer edge of the drive, near the iron gate, in the specific position of a man who was present but not affiliated, not in custody, not being directed, simply standing there the way a person stood when they were waiting for something they weren't sure was coming. She walked to him. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning. The comprehensive assessment, reading for damage and function, and what the person in front of him was actually capable of at this specific moment. She let him look. "Julian's alive," she said. "I know." His voice was flat. Not relieved, not disappointed, not anything she could easily name. "I heard. Your father's being processed, cooperative custody, based on the arrangement. I know that too." She stood beside him and they both looked at the estate, lit by the federal vehicle's light now, stripped of the warm, deliberate glow that had made it look welcoming, revealed as what it was. Stone and iron, and 40 years of accumulated decisions and their consequences, none of which had been inevitable and all of which had been chosen. "The case you built," she said. 14 months of work. Walsh has it. She'll use what's useful." He paused. "It's enough. Between what I had and what you delivered." "It was always going to be enough," she said. "You just needed the inside piece." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me that going in." "No." He didn't look away from the house. "I didn't," she breathed. The cold night air moved through the cedar trees along the estate's perimeter. The same trees that had been growing here before any of the schwa, before the iron gate and the security personnel and the 40 years of operational history. Trees that would be here after all of it was adjudicated and archived and reduced to case numbers. She found that thought unexpectedly something close to comforting. "Eli," she said. "He was removed at 6 this afternoon, before the ceremony began." Kyle's voice changed on this, not dramatically, but in the register beneath the flatness, something that was not flatness. "He's with people I trust, outside New York. He's safe. He needs a therapist who understands what he's been living in." "I know. A real one, not a Choi-approved one." "I know, Selene." She looked at the side of his face, the scarred knuckles, the jaw carrying the weight of everything it always carried. "What happens to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I testified. I'll continue to testify. The immunity arrangement covers my cooperation period." A pause. "After that?" He paused again, a longer pause. The pause of a man looking down a road he hasn't fully mapped. "I don't know what after that looks like yet. It doesn't look like New York." "No?" she said. "I wouldn't think so." They stood there for another minute. The federal radio traffic moved around them, the procedural sounds of an operation completing its initial phase. Somewhere inside the house a door opened and closed. A vehicle engine started. "You knew," she said, "going into that ceremony, what it was going to cost you." "Yes." "The family, the name, whatever remained of the life you'd built inside it. What remained wasn't worth the cost of keeping it." He said it simply, without self-pity. The way you stated a calculation, you'd run completely and arrived at the only answer the numbers supported. It hadn't been for a long time. She thought about Michelle Park, who had known that too, and had not been given the chance to act on it. She deserved better than what happened to her, Selene said. Kyle's jaw moved. Yes, he said. She did. And the fact that what she left behind is what made tonight possible, that doesn't balance it. I want to be clear about that. It doesn't balance it. Nothing balances it. His voice was rough now, stripped of the flat control he maintained as a default, something underneath it that had been there the whole time and had never had a space to be said. Nothing is supposed to balance it. She's gone. What we did tonight, what you did, it's the most that was possible. It's not the same thing as enough. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She let it stand as what it was, true, insufficient, and necessary to speak anyway. At 2:30, she got into the car. Walsh's office had arranged to take her back to the city. She looked out the window as the estate receded. The iron gate, the security cameras, the stone wall, the cedars. And she watched it get smaller and then disappear behind a turn in the road, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in the deep fundamental way. The way that came not from exertion, but from long-sustained tension finally releasing. The body discovering in the absence of the thing it had been braced against that bracing had been what it was doing all along. She fell asleep in this car. She slept without dreaming, which was a mercy she hadn't expected and accepted without question. The weeks that followed were their own kind of brutal. Federal depositions were long and specific and conducted in rooms designed to be nowhere. Rooms with the specific institutional neutrality of spaces meant to contain only what was brought into them and retain nothing. She testified about every conversation, every file, every decision, and its reasoning, and she did it with the clarity of someone who had nothing to hide and the stamina of someone who had learned early that stamina was the decisive variable in most of the contests that mattered. Walsh was present for most of it. She was a rigorous and precise questioner, and she was also, Selene came to understand across those weeks, genuinely interested in making the case hold. Not in the ambitious way, not in the career-building way, but in the way of someone who had been working toward a specific outcome for a long time, and understood that the outcome was larger than her role in it. The charges came in waves. 31 federal charges across 4 jurisdictions, as Walsh had said the first night. Julian Choi, in cooperative custody, provided additional testimony that deepened the financial case and implicated figures beyond the Choi family itself. The judge, 2 city officials, a state legislator, several executives whose names appeared in the financial records, and who had spent the weeks since the ceremony in the particular frantic activity of people trying to put distance between themselves and a thing they'd been attached to for years. Julian recovered from surgery. She was not present for that. She learned about it from news coverage, which was extensive. The story had broken within hours of the distribution. The 47 files and 2 videos received simultaneously by 6 journalists and an investigative news desk and a federal prosecutor producing the specific media event that happened when material that was both legally significant and narratively complete arrived fully formed into the hands of people trained to use it. The coverage was dense and fast and followed the particular rhythm of a major story that kept producing new material as additional charges and arrests and cooperating witnesses emerged over the weeks. She stopped reading the coverage after the first 10 days. Not because it was wrong, it was largely accurate, which was its own kind of exhausting, but because reading it required her to observe herself as a character in a story being told by other people, and she had not yet developed the emotional distance to do that without it costing her something she needed for other things. She went back to the studio. This was the decision people seemed most surprised by. The journalists who contacted her, the producer who called twice about a documentary, the 3 publishers who sent letters through the attorney Walsh had connected her with for the civil proceedings around the fraudulent financial documents bearing her name. They all seemed to have assumed, or hoped, that surviving what she'd survived would transform her into someone with a different relationship to her existing life. Someone who would step out of it and into a larger, more visible version. She went back to the studio on the 3rd Monday after the ceremony, and she unlocked the frosted glass door with the black stenciled lettering, and she turned the lights on, and she sat at her desk, and she looked at her schedule. She had 7 clients. The corporate executive with the board presentation was on at 10. The 17-year-old scholarship girl was on at 2. A new referral? A woman in her 40s who ran a nonprofit and had recently been appointed to a state advisory board and was terrified of the rooms she was about to have to walk into, was on at 4. She prepared for each of them. She thought about what they each needed specifically, and she made notes, and she was ready when each of them arrived, and she did the work with the full presence that the work required because they had come to her with something real, and the least she could give them was real attention. At the end of the day, she sat in the empty studio and she listened to the restaurant downstairs, the clatter of plates and the voices and the smell of rice and peppers coming up through the floor, and she felt the specific weight of an ordinary day completing itself. And she understood that she was grateful for it in a way she hadn't been capable of before, the way you could only be grateful for ordinary things after you'd spent long enough in proximity to their absence. The civil proceedings around the fraudulent documents took 4 months to resolve. The attorney Walsh had connected her with was a compact, meticulous woman named Reyes, who had spent a career dismantling financial fraud and approached the Selene Carter frame documents with the specific enthusiasm of someone who found this particular variety of criminal engineering genuinely interesting as an intellectual problem. Every document bearing Selene's forged signature was identified, authenticated as fraudulent through forensic analysis, and formally expunged. The 3 shell companies dissolved. The assets connected to them seized as criminal proceeds. Her name, at the end of those 4 months, was clean. She stood in Reyes's office on a gray February afternoon and received this information and felt, not relief, because relief implied the resolution of something that had been unbearable, and she had borne it, she had borne all of it, but something more like the sensation of a door being formally closed on a room you had passed through and were not returning to. "That's it?" she asked. "Legally," Reyes said. "That's it. Then I'm done here." Reyes looked at her with something that was not quite professional and not quite personal. The look of a person who has spent months working alongside someone and arrived at an opinion of them that surprised them. "You're remarkable. You know that." Selene picked up her bag. "I know how to be in rooms," she said. "That's all." "That's not all." She looked at Reyes for a moment. "Ask me in a year," she said, and left. She visited Eli once, in March. Kyle had arranged it through the people he trusted in a house in Connecticut that was ordinary in the way witness protection-adjacent arrangements tried to be ordinary. A suburb, a backyard, a school within walking distance, the deliberate assembly of the signifiers of normalcy around a child who had not experienced it. She drove up on a Saturday morning and she brought 2 books, and she sat with him in the backyard on a bench beside a dormant garden, and they talked for 2 hours. He was different than he'd been in the studio sessions, not unrecognizable. The dark, serious eyes were the same, and the habit of tucking his hands under his thighs when something was difficult, and the precise, careful way he answered questions as if accuracy was a form of respect. But there was something in the tenor of him that had loosened, some held thing that had been released by the distance from the estate and the months inside a house where the ambient noise was ordinary rather than threatening. He talked about his school, a teacher he liked, a book he'd read that he wanted to recommend to her. He talked around the harder things with the practiced indirection of a child who was in therapy and learning that he had the option to approach difficult things sideways, at his own pace rather than head-on. Toward the end of the visit, sitting with his hands between his knees and looking at the dormant garden, he said, "Do you think she would have liked you?" She knew who he meant. "I think," she said carefully, "that she would have been glad someone was looking after you." He thought about that for a while. "She was brave," he said. "What she did, hiding everything." "She was," Selene said. "She was very brave." "Are you brave?" She looked at him. The serious face, the dark eyes, the rocket ship pajamas replaced now by a plain blue sweatshirt and jeans, the ordinary clothes of an ordinary boy having an ordinary Saturday, and all of it so recently impossible that the ordinariness of it had a specific weight, the weight of things that had cost something to arrive. "I was scared the whole time," she said. "If that's brave, then yes." He nodded, considering. "Kyle says scared and brave are the same thing," he said. "He says the difference is what you do with it." "Kyle's right about that. He said to tell you he's in Portland." Eli glanced at her sideways, checking her face with the precise attention of someone who understood that certain information landed differently depending on the person receiving it. He said you'd know what that means. She did know what that meant. It meant he was somewhere far enough from New York to begin the work of building a life that wasn't organized around the Choi name. And it meant he'd chosen to tell her, which was its own kind of communication from a man who communicated through what he chose rather than what he said. "Tell him I said good," she said. Eli nodded solemnly, as if delivering her message was a responsibility he intended to execute with full accuracy. She drove back to the Bronx in the March afternoon, the highway unspooling gray and familiar, the city resolving out of the distance the way it always did. The particular skyline she had grown up watching from public housing windows and learned to read the way other people read landscapes, knowing where the money was and where it wasn't, where the visibility was and where you disappeared, where you had to fight to be seen, and where you could sometimes, if you were careful and fortunate and willing to pay the price, simply be. She thought about Julian. He was awaiting trial in federal custody, his legal team working through the specific procedural machinery of someone who had resources and would use them for as long as the resources held, which would not be as long as he needed. The evidence was too comprehensive. Walsh had been too thorough. Jinsu's cooperation had been too specific. The outcome was not certain, because outcomes were never certain, but the probability distribution had shifted permanently and irrevocably, and everyone who understood probability distributions could read that. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She did not feel nothing about it either. She felt the complicated, inarticulate thing that occupied the space between justice and its cost, the thing that had no name in any language she'd been given because it was not resolved and was not supposed to be resolved, because some things had no resolution, only continuation, only the ongoing fact of your own living in proximity to what had happened. She thought about standing in the corridor of the estate looking at family photographs. On a night that felt like years ago, listening to Kyle Choi say, "You're sleeping with the wrong brother," in the flat, conversational tone of a warning she hadn't yet had the framework to decode. She thought about how long the warning had been true before anyone said it. She thought about all the women who had been in rooms like that one, rooms built by powerful men to extract from women whatever the men needed and discard the remainder, and had not had Michelle's evidence or Kyle's information or 14 years of learning how to read the architecture of power before walking into it. Women who had been calibrated for and consumed and had no flash drive hidden in a book binding, no protected backup, no 47 files. That thought was the one that stayed. It stayed through the spring and into the summer as she continued at the studio, as the trial dates were set, as the media coverage moved through its cycles and found new developments, and returned to old ones, and eventually settled into the longer, less urgent rhythm of a story that was important but no longer immediate. It stayed through the evenings when she sat in her apartment on Tremont Avenue with the city sounds coming through the window and thought about what she was doing and what she wanted to be doing and whether those were the same thing. By September, she had started running workshops. Not the studio sessions. Those continued, the individual clients, the etiquette and presence work she was genuinely good at and which continued to pay for her life. The workshops were different, 3 hours on Saturday mornings, open enrollment, held in the community room of a public library 3 blocks from where she'd grown up. She charged a sliding scale that went down to nothing for women who had nothing, and she filled every session within 48 hours of announcing it. She did not teach table manners. She taught what she'd actually learned, distilled into the vocabulary of women who did not have the luxury of learning it the way she had. She taught how to read a room's power structure in the first 60 seconds, how to recognize the specific behavioral patterns of predatory systems dressed as opportunity, how to build information networks that belong to you and no one else, how to document, encrypt, protect, how to carry evidence the way Michelle Park had carried it, carefully, against the possibility that you might not be there to use it yourself. She taught them to recognize the slow smile. She taught them to listen to the breath. She taught them what she wished someone had taught her before a charming man in a charcoal suit had walked into her doorway on a Tuesday afternoon. The women who came were in their 20s and their 50s and everywhere between. They came from the Bronx and from neighborhoods across the city, and sometimes from farther. They sat in folding chairs in a public library community room, and they listened, and they asked questions that were sharp and specific and personal, in the way that questions became when the material was not theoretical. She did not tell them her story. Not directly, not in the workshop context. They mostly knew it. It had been in every publication. It was a matter of federal record. It was the kind of story that moved through the communities that needed it most through the specific channels of women talking to women about the things that happened to women. They knew who she was. What she gave them instead was utility, the specific, practical, hard-won knowledge of someone who had been inside the machine and understood its mechanics. One afternoon in late October, she was locking up the studio. The last client gone, the heat turned down, the lights off, when she stopped at the frosted glass door and looked at the lettering. Carter Presents Consulting. 3 years on the glass, a little worn at the edges of the C. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the cracked heel on a Tuesday morning and the coffee going cold and the way she'd told herself it would hold until Thursday. She thought about how much she'd been carrying without knowing she was carrying it, the way you carried things that had been yours since before you had words for them. She turned the key in the lock. She walked down the stairs past the smell of rice and Scotch bonnet peppers and out into the Bronx, into the specific cold clarity of a late October evening, and she walked the 4 blocks to her building with her hands in her pockets and the city around her doing what cities did, noise and movement, and the 10,000 simultaneous lives that constituted the only kind of permanence that had ever actually existed. And she went upstairs. She made the tea she'd never finished making on the night this began. She sat at her kitchen table and drank it. Outside the window, the city went about its business, indifferent and alive, the only witness to anything that mattered, the only record that outlasted the names of the people who had moved through it. She thought about Julian's grave, which did not yet exist and might not for years, and she thought about what she would say if she ever stood in front of it, and the sentence that arrived was the same sentence that had been true from the beginning, true before she'd known it was true. True in the corridor with the photographs and the warning she hadn't decoded. You were with the wrong brother. Not a victory, not a consolation, just the accurate statement of a fact that had mattered and still mattered and would matter after the trial and after the sentences and after everything had been adjudicated and archived and reduced to the official language of outcomes. Some facts were like that. They didn't stop being true just because the story had ended. She finished her tea. She washed the cup. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. And outside the window, the Bronx breathed and moved and continued. And in the morning, she would get up and run 3 miles and unlock the studio and teach people what she knew about the rooms that were built to keep them out. And she would do it without triumph and without bitterness, and with the specific clear-eyed attention of someone who understood what the work was actually for. Not for herself, not anymore, not only. For the women who came to the library on Saturday mornings with their sharp, specific questions. For the 17-year-old with the scholarship. For Eli, in Connecticut, learning what ordinary felt like. For Michelle Park, who had been thorough and brave and who had trusted the right person with the right evidence at the only moment she had left. Selene Carter closed her eyes. The city held her. She slept.